Sarge, I got it all figured out. Lee Harvey Oswald wanted to steal the Jack Ruby!
Jack Ruby was a man, not a jewel.
Oh! All right, we're back to square one.
U.S. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. Within hours of his death, a gun was found in a nearby building, and police arrested the accused killer, Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald denied it.
I didn't shoot anybody.
He said somebody had set him up.
I'm just a patsy.
And Paul, I've got to ask you the same question that Jim has probably asked over and over and over again. Do you think that Lee Harvey Oswald was the only person involved? Do you think he was the gunman, the sole gunman in the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
I think the fact that they found three, what I based my decision on was the fact they found 3 cartridge cases in the school book depository. And it had to be one person. And I feel comfortable at this point that that's who it was, and he was the lone assassin.
To the book depository! You hit him high, I'll hit him low. Go, 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 go.
Was it your understanding that Phillips was also Oswald's CIA contact?
I learned that when I was down there. That is the first time he introduced me to Lee Harvey Oswald, and he also instructed me that Lee could be trusted and that he was Lee's controller.
He made that as a statement.
He made it as a statement because I wanted to know who he was dealing with and who I was giving weapons to.
I need you to make a statement that I was introduced by Phillips, and who was my CIA handler, and I was told that he was Oswald.
We didn't call them handlers back then. We called them controllers.
Okay.
Okay. David Atlee Phillips, he introduced me to Lee Harvey Oswald. And upon doing this, he also explained to me that he was Lee Harvey Oswald's controller, the same as he was mine.
But when the Dallas police searched his belongings, they found these. 2 photos of Oswald posing in his backyard, holding the gun that killed the president. The photos definitively linked Oswald to the murder weapon and made the case against him airtight in the minds of investigators. But when they showed Oswald the photos, he insisted they were fakes and that his head had been superimposed onto someone else's body to frame him. The next day, Oswald was shot to death while in police custody, sparking rumors that the US government was covering up the real story of the assassination and who else might be involved.
I can tell you from my experiences having tried several hundred cases to verdict and being responsible for thousands of cases as head of the criminal courts and running the Homicide Bureau, that I don't believe there's any courtroom in America where Oswald would have been convicted on the evidence that was presented before the Warren Commission.
I don't know if anybody is innocent. I know the case which has been presented against him is full of falsehoods and contradictions. And I know that right now in the office of the Dallas District Attorney is a paraffin test which shows that Lee Harvey Oswald did not fire a rifle on November 22nd, 1963. I know that because I have a photostatic copy of that document.
It appeared on the cover of Life magazine in February 1964 and circulated in global newspapers. People were quick to notice something odd. The rifle on the cover of Life had a telescopic sight, and in other news outlets, the scope was gone. The news outlets explained they retouched the photo before printing and inadvertently altered the appearance of the rifle.
Do you think Lee Harvey Oswald fired any shots that day?
Lee Harvey Oswald never fired a shot. And if anybody knows what a paraffin test is, and we have actual court documents on where Lee Harvey Oswald was given a paraffin test by the Dallas Police Department, and on this document it plainly states, deceased J.D. Tippit, deceased John F. Kennedy, suspect Lee Harvey Oswald. And they took a paraffin test, his face, his hand, his arm, I guess the side of his neck, and the only trace of any nitrates from powder burns or powder suspicions was in the palm of his hand. And anybody that goes to a firing range that fires weapons knows if you fire a .38 revolver or any type of revolver, the blow bite is going to come back across this part of your hand and your wrist. The only reason he had those nitrates in the palm of his hand is he was holding spent shell casings when I calibrated the scope.
Other witnesses saw a rifle fire from the Texas School Book Depository building. An officer actually had 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald at gunpoint just after the assassination, but let him go.
Lee Harvey Oswald is first seen about 90 seconds after the last shot is fired. He's seen in the lunchroom on the second floor of the school book depository.
Bill Newman told us what he saw and heard in Dealey Plaza is etched deep into his memory.
As the president got maybe some 100 feet from us, the first two shots rang out. It was a boom, boom, like that. And at the time, I thought somebody had thrown a couple of firecrackers against the car, and I thought, well, that's a poor joke to play on the president. And of course, you know, he come up like that in the seat. And as they got closer to us, you could tell there was something wrong because you could see the blood on Governor Connolly's shirt in the seat and his eyes protruding, and President Kennedy was kind of looking into the crowd, it looked to me like. And just as the car passed and got right in front of us here, the third shot rang out and the side of the president.
Station 5 to move all men available out of my department back into the railroad yard there in an effort to try to determine if what and when happened down there and hold everything secure until the homicide and other investigators can get things secure.
As experienced law enforcement, they knew that's the sinister area. That's the place to send my men.
Based on that information and more, Thompson published a book that concluded President Kennedy died in a barrage of gunfire. 4 shots from 3 locations in just under 6 seconds. Along with the Texas School Book Depository and the grassy knoll, Thompson wrote one shot came from the roof of the Dallas County Records Building, the only spot that matched the angle of the bullet as it traveled through Governor Connolly's chest.
But I'm hearing the shots being fired, and I'm counting them as a miss. And that's the only thing I'm concerned about. I've got this sign there for the Simmons Freeway that is fixing to come into my field of fire. As far as I can see at this point, the President has not been hit in the head at this time. I've seen the body lurch. I know he's been hit. How serious, I don't know. But my last instructions was we're going for a headshot. If you have to take a shot, take it. But don't fire unless it's a necessity, unless you really have to. He said, Jimmy, don't fire unless you have to. We want everything from the backside. I'm not asking why. Okay, whatever you say. At this point, as it starts to approach and come behind that freeway sign, and I've already been instructed not to hit anybody but Kennedy because they didn't want Jackie getting hurt or anybody else, I'm fixing to lose my field of fire. And at this point, either I shoot or I can put it in a suitcase and leave, one or the other. I took the shot. I fired one shot only.
And where were you aiming?
Well, I was aiming for his right eye, which to me is the left side of his head looking head on. But for him, it would be his right eye. And once I pull the trigger, I'm right in on it, and it's almost like looking 6 feet away through the scope. As I squeezed, take off my round, his head moved forward, I missed, and I coming right along the temple.
311. This is 312. Notice 312 is really clear. It's preternaturally clear. Somehow the film lined up with the lens just perfectly. But now look what happens. 313, there's an explosion in Kennedy's head. That's the climax of the film. It was never mentioned in the Warren Report or its 26 volumes. You wouldn't know it happened.
The Warren Commission did publish still frames from the Zapruder film in the volumes of evidence, but something had changed.
The head explodes in 313. 314 looked very strange to the educated eye, and so did 315. It turned out they had been reversed. That what is obviously in the original film, a movement like this, is made to look like a forward movement.
A forward movement that would support the lone gunman theory.
And if we freeze on frame 138, we distinctly see a puff of blue hair coming from the grassy knoll.
They find a bunch of footprints. It had rained that morning and cleared at about 9:30, so by 12:30 it's perfectly clear. But the ground was wet, so there were footprints and cigarette butts.
And he told you that the footprints looked like a big cat had been pacing back and forth.
Back and forth, back and forth. And also there was mud up on the bumper of the car, and also the horizontal supports also had mud on them.
So mud footprints up on the support,
Right.
looking over.
When you reversed your jacket.
I've already reversed my jacket. When I picked up the gun case, I reversed my jacket, no plaid side. I got the poplin gray material on the outside. I took the fedora I had shoved down in the sleeve of it, snapped it out, put it back on my head, and I walked away. Here in the briefcase, and my .45 inside my coat pocket.
Governor Connolly could very possibly have been shot in the back with the assassin's bullets still coming from the front of the car.
Absolutely.
And just to put a fine point on this, the mission of the Warren Commission wasn't the truth.
No. The mission of the Warren Commission, simply put, was the prosecution of Oswald. There wasn't any defense. If you do a prosecution with no defense, this is what you get.
The Warren Commission was also hamstrung by the FBI and CIA. Both agencies intentionally misled investigators, withholding the fact that they monitored Oswald in the months before the assassination. In April of that same year, he used his Carcano rifle in Dallas to shoot at a strident anti-communist, U.S. Army Major General Edwin Walker, according to Oswald's widow. Another challenge for the commission? We now know Chief Justice Warren suppressed key evidence based on his close friendship with the Kennedy family. He denied access to the autopsy photos and refused to allow interviews to explore Oswald's Mexico connections. The end result? An incomplete investigation at best, at worst, a cover-up.
They also, in the matter of the autopsy, the brain is intact. And it was photographed as such. It was a clean. The whole area was still there. Whereas it's impossible because the brain was seen. You see it spraying out in the car during the Zapruder film.
Yeah.
And when they weigh the brain, as they do in an autopsy, it comes out normal.
Well, not just normal, but extra large, right?
A little bit. Yeah.
Larger than average. Like
Yeah.
it was like.
It's impossible. And what's more important is, and this drives a stake again through the heart of it, the photographer of the autopsy, John Stringer, the autopsy photographer. He's a straight guy. He's, pro-Warren Commission, all that stuff. They bring him back. The ARB brings him back, and they show him the photos that we now have of the that are in the National Archives, and he says, I never photographed that.
Right.
It was he took an up view of the brain. He never took a basilar view from below.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I never photographed that.
And
that's very important.
There's also some evidence that they had drawn hair in to cover up the exit wound.
Yes. I don't know about the evidence, but definitely the photograph shows that the hair had been pulled in.
What do you think of that picture? That's the back of Kennedy's head.
From what I'm looking at here, looks like part of the flap on the side is missing. But I don't see very much in this picture here, the back of the head missing. What I'm looking at here is a lot of hair.
The federal government immediately decided, for reasons of state, that there was a single assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, that would be the story.
Internal memos and recordings surfaced years later, showing how quickly that decision came after President Kennedy's death. On the same day as the funeral, Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach sent this memo to the new Johnson White House. The public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who are still at large, and that evidence was such that he would have been convicted at trial. It continues. Speculation about Oswald's motivation ought to be cut off, and we should have some basis for rebutting thought that this was a communist conspiracy, or, as the Iron Curtain Press is saying, a right-wing conspiracy to blame it on the communists. Unfortunately, the facts on Oswald seem about too pat, too obvious. Marxist, Cuba, Russian wife, etc.
In that memo, Katzenbach points out that the very integrity of the U.S. government is being brought into question by this, that the people in the United States have to be assured, beyond any reasonable doubt, that there was only Oswald. There were no conspirators, nothing beyond that.
The shot is bizarre. It's bizarre shots. But so the autopsy is off. The brain is off. Photos are off. Then you go, the Garrison trial revealed that one of the autopsists, Peter Fink, saying that they were not in charge of the autopsy. The military was.
Right.
They wouldn't let him put his finger in the back hole.
Right.
They told him what to do. and they were very bullying. In fact, there was. Can you imagine doing an autopsy on the president and having 20 or 30 people looking at you from a gallery?
And they were telling him what he was able to do and not able to do. So the autopsy was being directed.
Yeah, I showed that in the movie. Don't touch that.
Right.
Don't do that.
Which is so you have to think that.
Plus, they have the best autopsy people in the world, civilian, all around Washington. Why wouldn't they call them in? No.
Right.
This idea of collaboration in the space program clearly set off alarm bells with MJ-12 and some parts of the administration. And the concern was, look, we have alien technology here. We don't want to share it with the Soviets.
And that was the last straw. That was the thing that the national security state, the CIA, Allen Dulles, MJ-12, absolutely could not tolerate.
Perhaps the most interesting is what we mentioned in the piece, just more details about a visit that Oswald had made to Mexico in the weeks leading up to the assassination, as he was apparently attempting to try to get back to the USSR. Turns out the U.S. was tapping phones into the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. The Mexican president was aware of this as well, and it was his office that tipped off the CIA that Oswald had been making calls into the Soviet embassy the day after the assassination.
I didn't see anybody, but I saw an intact, fully bullet on the back of the seat where the cushioning met the trunk of the car. And I picked it up and looked at it, and it was, only thing I noticed that was wrong with it were bullet striations. There was no other deformities. I started to put it back. Mrs. Kennedy and Clint were leaving the car, and I made a quick decision. I didn't see anybody to secure the car. People were emerging on the car. I did not want this piece of evidence to disappear, and I slipped it into my pocket. We raced through the lobby of the emergency room. On the way out of the car, I noticed Mrs. Kennedy's pillbox hat, her clutch purse, and I picked them up, and then I noticed there was a Zippo cigarette lighter on the seat. It was all covered with blood, and I turned it over, and it had the presidential seal on it. I thought it was Mrs. Kennedy's, or came out of her purse. Didn't think anything else of it, but I figured that Mrs. Kennedy didn't need to see this. So I slipped that in my pocket, too.
Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent who climbed on the back of the limo after Kennedy was shot, questions Landis's story.
Why do you have doubts about his account?
Because if you check all the evidence, statements, things that happened, they don't line up. It doesn't make any sense to me that he's trying to put it on the president's journey.
No, I don't think that they were on board with this.
And for MJ-12, sharing UFO secrets was a big problem. Their response may have been pulled from a fire. When and where, nobody knows. Like all MJ-12 documents, the authenticity of this burned memo is considered suspect by mainstream historians. But for UFO researchers, this 9-page document is explosive new evidence never before seen on national television. Page 1 refers directly to the president. As you must know, Lancer has made some inquiries regarding our activities, which we cannot allow.
Each president is given a nickname of sorts, and this is for security reasons. And Lancer is absolutely John F. Kennedy.
This was a classic conflict between the president and the intelligence community. And it was showing to be beyond the control of any president.
And perhaps the most chilling page of the burned memo states, when conditions become non-conducive for growth in our environment and Washington cannot be influenced any further, the weather is lacking any precipitation. It should be wet.
The tracheotomy and also the description of the exit wound
in
his head.
Well, that comes out later.
Yeah.
Although some people didn't see it, but 40 people. What the ARB did, thank God, was to collect all the people who saw the rear exit wound, and it was huge. We showed it in the film. We showed the 40 people who saw it.
What's really crazy to document in the film was the fact that it wasn't really his brain. I
was going to go to that.
Please. The brain that they had used as a piece of evidence that this was Kennedy's brain had clearly been in formaldehyde for at least 2 weeks.
Yeah.
In fact, in 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations publishes their findings in the reinvestigation of JFK's murder that includes 2 bombshells. 1, scientific acoustical evidence establishes a high probability that 2 gunmen fired at the president. And 2, the committee believes that President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as the result of a conspiracy.
Most of the files are under the lock and key of the CIA, but 23% are controlled by the FBI. Some conspiracy theorists are still convinced that the files contain evidence that the CIA was involved in Kennedy's death. As recently as 2007, an extremely ill ex-CIA agent, E. Howard Hunt, personally named a handful of CIA operatives, as well as Lyndon B. Johnson, as the true culprits behind the assassination.
As we said, there has been no word at all on the official word from the doctors at Parkland Hospital or the White House staff on the extent of the president's wounds. Mrs. Kennedy is in the hospital, as we said. So is Mrs. Connolly, the governor's wife, as are indeed most members of the White House staff. He was carrying a large staff with him on this tour to Texas. It is believed that a gap in the motorcade perhaps saved Vice President Johnson from being a target of the assassin today. The gap had opened up in the motorcade just before the assassin's bullets rang out.
Conspiracy theorists of all stripes often argue that a man spotted nearby with an umbrella may have been involved.
The only person under any umbrella in all of Dallas standing right at the location where all the shots come into the limousine.
Maybe you ought to turn that way with it.
Other dead-end theories over the years include this Secret Service agent with a rifle in the motorcade slipped and shot the president.
Former Secret Service agent Paul Landis, who was with the president that day, is opening up for the first time about what he witnessed. For decades, the prevailing theory was that one bullet struck JFK and then hit Texas Governor John Connolly, who was sitting in front of him. It became known as the magic bullet theory, which explained how one shooter could have fired all the shots. The theory is based on this bullet being found on Governor Connolly's gurney at the hospital. But now in a new book, Landis says he knows how it got there. The 88-year-old tells the New York Times he found that bullet lodged in the car seat behind where Kennedy was killed. He says he then took that bullet to the hospital and placed it on the president's gurney. It was a piece of evidence, he tells the Times, and I didn't want it to disappear or get lost. So it was, Paul, you've got to make a decision, and I grabbed it. But Landis now says he thinks the bullet may have rolled from Kennedy's gurney to Connolly's, meaning it may not have been the bullet that injured Connolly.
Dr. Aguilar, you studied this case for years. How significant is this?
I think this is a significant piece of new evidence to support the idea that there was more than one gunman in Dealey
Was there
Plaza.
a practical reason for President Kennedy having 2 caskets, or was the government trying to cover up something about his assassination? Then 3 years after the president was killed, the first casket was dropped into the ocean. However, Kermit L. Hall, a one-time member of the Assassination Records Review Board, told the Los Angeles Times that the first casket was ultimately disposed of so that it didn't turn into a historic relic for the marketplace.
This all started in 1981 when Lee Harvey Oswald was exhumed, then reburied in another casket. On the 8th floor of the Tarrant County Courthouse, a fight over who owns this crumbling coffin that Lee Harvey Oswald was originally buried in.
Well, I would suspect, that it had to be destroyed. simply because, what do you do with a used casket?
The United States government has the right to keep the JFK documents secret if releasing them will compromise security in some way. This is due to a clause in the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act passed in 1992. The act stipulated that the documents should be released by 2017, 25 years later. President Donald Trump made moves to honor that promise when he was in office. However, he later announced that some files would remain secret.
The president issued a memo saying there is potentially irreversible harm to national security if all the records are released.
All right, now this is fascinating. The National Archives has released more than 13,000 files related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas, while riding in his motorcade in 1963. An investigation concluded he was murdered by former Marine Lee Harvey Oswald, who had lived in the former Soviet Union. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe has more on what the documents say.
What really happened that day?
It was the 1991 release of the movie JFK by director Oliver Stone that revived conspiracy theories and prompted a new law ordering the classified documents related to the Kennedy assassination be released by October 2017.
Trump's administration okayed the release of 19,045 files, but a majority of the documents still had key names and details redacted, according to the Washington Post. According to a report released by Politico, CIA and FBI officials have been embroiled in a multi-year-long conflict over the release of the documents in an attempt to keep them secret. Some of those fighting for secrecy have stated that they wish to protect the safety and privacy of still living agents and informants.
But then President Donald Trump pushed back the release date, citing national security concerns. And President Biden gave agencies until yesterday to release most of the rest.
President Biden believes all information related to President Kennedy's assassination should be released to the greatest extent possible.
The release includes a document detailing how the CIA intercepted an October 1963 phone call suspected Kennedy assassin Lee Harvey Oswald made while in Mexico City to the Soviet embassy, just weeks before that fateful day in Dallas.
In 2021, Biden issued a memo to further delay the release of most of the materials once again. In response, the Mary Farrell Foundation began a lawsuit against Biden and the National Archives this October.
Why are they suing?
Because they don't trust the CIA, the government, or the White House in this case.
Long story, but I need you to follow me to the assassination floor for no reason. Let's see, where is it? If we just take this service hallway, no.
Hey, who's this handsome man about town? I like the cut of your jib, fella. Me too. Me three. Let's get this party started.
Landing orientation film? Why did we even kidnap Ken Burns if no one's watched the movie?
In 1962, President Kennedy had a dream to reach the moon, mostly because he'd achieved every sexual experience on Earth and wanted to see what space sex was like. We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because I am hard.
Nice.
But the lure of casual sex proved too much for the astronauts, who created a free love commune and refused to return home. To avoid a national PR disaster, the shadow government recruited crisis actors to play the rogue astronauts. Kubrick was hired to fake the return trip, and the moon was privately declared a hostile nation. The rogue colony still exists to this day.